I'm Terry Newman, senior editor and columnist with National Post, and I have with me tonight Philip Cross. Philip, thanks for joining us.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me on.
Great. So the topic of tonight's talk is who is Mark Carney, which is obviously a big question on all Canadians' minds. I mean, we know he's been the Bank of Canada governor and the UK governor as well. But we really don't know much more than that about him or his record. So I'm looking forward to this chat with you tonight. So another thing I want to tell audience members is that you're able to ask us questions. And you can do so by going to the Q&A section of your browser and typing a question. And our moderators will get around to submitting them to us, and hopefully we'll get around to your questions. So please do that. Philip, before we start with who is Mark Carney, who is Philip Cross? Why are you here? Why are you the person to talk about Mark Carney?
Well, I was chief economic analyst at Statistics Canada for 36 years, and a big part of my job was monitoring the macroeconomy. And anybody who follows the macroeconomy in Canada lives and dies with every word that comes out of the governor of the Bank of Canada. So I've been following Carney's career since he became governor of the Bank of Canada. And since then, since I left Statistics Canada almost 15 years ago, I've maintained an interest in macroeconomics and in particularly in monetary policy. One of the things I'll note is that, I noticed Mark Carney's arrival at the Bank of Canada immediately. As I say, I would read every statement, every speech that came out of the Bank of Canada, and as soon as Carney took over, you could see right away there was a marked improvement in the clarity and cohesion of the bank's communication. So this guy is very good at communicating. You may not agree with what he communicates, and I'll be discussing a lot of my reservations later on. But don't underestimate, he's a very good communicator, and that's one of his major attributes.
Another thing that most Canadians might not know is what exactly is the role of a governor of the Bank of Canada or the governor of the Bank of UK? Like, what are they supposed to do? What historically have they been responsible for?
Well, lots of little things. I think from the point of view of your listening audience tonight, the bank's responsible for two major things. One is manipulating monetary policy, especially interest rates, to serve as a short-term stabilization tool. I mean, a lot of things, as we know, knocks the economy around. And a lot of these shocks come out of the blue, and you have to react very quickly, and you don't have time to recall Parliament and issue a fiscal statement and change taxes and regulations, and which will take months, if not years, to have an effect. So one thing, big part of the toolkit of policymakers, particularly to fight off short-term shocks to the economy, is monetary policy. The other one, the longer-term concern of monetary policy, is the stability of the financial system and especially the health of our banks. And there, though, that's sort of a joint responsibility. That isn't just the bank's responsibility. Remember when back during when the subprime mortgages were very popular in the U.S. in the mid-2000s, you remember that our major banks here tried to merge with each other, and it was Jim Flaherty, the Minister of Finance, who blocked that attempt at mergers. So that shows that there's sometimes the bank is responsible for some aspects of financial stability, and at other times it's the Minister of Finance. But those are the two major responsibilities of any central bank.
Interesting. So, did anything different happen when Carney took the role as the governor of the Bank of Canada and the governor of the Bank of the UK? Did he do things differently than other people? I know we had spoke previously about two specific things. The idea of forward guidance. So I'm wondering if you can define forward guidance and explain what that is, and if Carney played any role in that.
Right. Well, first of all, to answer the broader question, central banks, particularly amongst the G7, when they're faced with a major crisis like the global financial crisis in 2008 or the pandemic, there's a lot of coordination. No bank is going to go off on its own. So it's a small club, and they act as members of a club, and there's a lot of groupthink that goes on. And we'll get into some of the problems of that later. But one of the things, what Carney tried to do that was just so when he first arrived in the job, the global financial crisis was just unfolding in 2008. In fact, one of the first things he did was cut interest rates a half a point within a month of taking over the job. And that basically is something he's done in response to every crisis. It's cut interest rates and worry about the long-term consequences later. But that was part of, every central bank was doing that. The Federal Reserve Board was cutting interest rates rapidly in 2008. So there wasn't anything unique about Carney in that. What he tried to set himself apart from the crowd in 2008, 2009 was he suggested that central banks should give forward guidance, that we wouldn't just cut interest rates, but we would tell people that they will be lower for, in the case of 2008, 2009, he said they would be lower for a year. And the idea was that would give people certainty, and they would be more willing to take advantage of low interest rates if they knew that there was no chance, for example, that they would jump up tomorrow. All of that sounds great, except when Steve Pollitt took over, one of the first things Steve Pollitt said was, I'm not doing forward guidance. You can forget that. I think it's a dumb idea. And the reason for that was borne out during the pandemic when Tiff Macklin gave forward guidance. He cut interest rates and told people, you can borrow at these low interest rates and not worry about rates going up for an extended period of time. And within a year, he had to start hiking rates because inflation took off. And of course, then people got really upset saying, just a second, you told me I could borrow at low rates and now you're raising rates. And, that's why a lot of people want Macklin's scalp. So that shows what was one of the risks of forward guidance, and that Steve Pollitt was correct in saying, no, the future is unknowable. There's too much uncertainty. There's negative shocks come along to the economy, but there's also other types of shocks like inflation shocks and supply side shocks. And I'm not going to promise something that I may not be able to deliver. So he did try to be different in developing this tool of forward guidance. It really hasn't caught on in the central bank community for reasons that became painfully obvious to Tiff Macklin in 2022.
Right. So that was the beginning of forward guidance with Carney. Was the beginning of sort of kind of like the setting the expectation. You are going to be able to borrow low for a certain period of time so that you can plan. But of course, the issue is that the bank may have to adjust that. They really just can't promise those types of things. They can't control those factors. And so what we saw in Canada is people, buying properties, very expensive properties that they probably couldn't afford when interest rates go up, or a second property, and being left with the mess that eventually Tiff Macklin pretty much inherited much later.
Yes.
So that's very interesting. And the other thing is Carney as well. Was he also involved in the movement that was taking place with banks with their extensive support for net zero policies and initiatives? Was that also a new thing?
Oh yes, he's been very much in the forefront of that. It was his idea. Remember too that his wife is a quite vocal environmentalist, and Carney began campaigning as soon as he took over as governor of the Bank of Canada. Began campaigning for the idea that banks should start taking account of climate change and the risk to the financial system from that in making their lending decisions. After leaving the Bank of England, he was one of the founders of the Net Zero Banking Alliance. He was also part of, there's a major American bank. Let me check my notes here. He pushed for what's called the Net Zero Asset Management Initiative, which unfortunately just suspended operations in January as a bunch of major U.S. banks decided that this just isn't going to work. What they found was that trying to make joining a global coalition when you have to report to national regulators,
Mm-hmm.
it was just too complicated to reconcile the two. And just more generally, it was part of this ESG movement, which firms are fleeing from left and right these days.
Mm-hmm.
But yes, he was very much a part of that initiative. And that's an initiative that actually has probably fared worse than the forward guidance. You could say forward guidance had some success in limited circumstances, but all these net zero banking alliances are collapsing now. They began in Glasgow in 2021 to much fanfare, and here we are, just a little over 2 years later, and the whole thing seems to be petering out. Very much as Carney's support for other climate initiatives like the carbon tax has come to naught, or he now acknowledges that that wasn't a good idea. So this whole push into environmental and climate change has been um, not well thought out, shall we say.
Yeah. It seems unprecedented. Do banks usually take on side projects like that um, in terms of things going outside of their nation? Can you think of anything else, like off the top of your head? Do banks usually involve themselves, national banks, in global interests?
No, and particularly they don't stray outside of economics. I mean, there was even within economics, it's quite extraordinary. You remember there was a great kerfuffle earlier this year when the deputy governor of the Bank of Canada, Caroline Rogers, gave a speech in which she said that the productivity crisis in Canada was, quote, a break the glass problem. You might remember there's a great deal of furor around that because it's very rare that the bank even gets a, as I say, the bank's mandate is short-term stabilization and longer-term financial stability. The bank can't really influence things like productivity. Productivity is related to things like infrastructure and
Hmm.
education and regulate, all tax policy,
Hmm.
all these things that are way beyond the bank. So it's very unusual. The only justification for the bank commenting on productivity is that productivity is becoming so bad, it's becoming an inflationary force. And I think that justifies why the bank occasionally would get involved in something like that, but that's really quite extraordinary. So yes, to if getting involved in something like productivity is extraordinary, getting involved in something like climate change, which is way beyond certainly short-term stabilization policy. Uh, Carney tried to sell it as, well, there's some type of long-term risk to financial stability here, but there really wasn't any take-up amongst other central banks, and especially the Federal Reserve Board has shown no interest in this. And if the Federal Reserve Board isn't interested, it's not going to fly at G7 central bank meetings. So
Hmm.
yes, the short answer to your question is yes, it was really quite extraordinary for a central bank to get involved in environmental and climate change issues.
Right. And then all of them across the globe. Many of them across the globe doing it together. It was new. I have a question from one of our viewers. Did Mark Carney predict deflation as a result of the COVID pandemic, as Brian Lilly claimed he did? I can't find confirmation of this. The actual result was, of course, inflation. Do you know anything about any predictions about deflation that came from Mark Carney during COVID?
I no, I don't
Mm.
remember any central banker. I mean, they should have. Frankly, I mean, the way unemployment was going up, if you believe in Phillips Curve's models of inflation, which is the working model of central banks, it's not a very
Hmm.
good model, but that's the best they got at the moment.
Hmm.
That's one of the problems of the Phillips curve is that the sharp increase in unemployment during the great financial crisis or again during the pandemic should have led to much lower inflation than we actually saw. We should have
Hmm.
seen in some cases outright deflation.
Hmm.
And that showed that there was a basic flaw in how central banks, I mean, one of the more open and honest members of the Federal Reserve Board in the United States admitted that we don't really have a working model of inflation. Central banks don't have a working model of inflation. That's a problem when your central mandate is to keep inflation down and you don't really have a working model of inflation dynamics. the proof of that, of course, was that after injecting all this massive stimulus into the economy in 2021, inflation took off in a way that completely surprised all the major central banks. So yeah, Houston, we've got a problem here.
Yeah, that's really interesting. You would think with upcoming AI and all the historical figures and numbers that we have about markets that we couldn't just pop something in and say, this is what happens when we have this factor and we inject money into the economy and kind of get closer and closer to an idea of what might happen during something like a pandemic. Again, probably not a great idea to use it to predict, given the idea of prediction and forecasting not working out very well. In terms of Carney's performance in both of his governor roles in Canada and the UK, from your knowledge and what you know about what he's done, how did he do? Like, how does he measure up?
Well, as I say, the central banks act. The old joke is the herd instincts amongst economists make sheep look like independent thinkers. That herd instinct is especially strong among central bankers. There's a lot of communication amongst themselves, and they would never make a move. I mean, I was debating Steve Pollitt last week in Toronto, and Governor Pollitt mentioned that he would always get a heads up call from the Federal Reserve Board or the European Central Bank ahead of time, that we're going to do this tomorrow, and we don't want you to be blindsided. So there's a lot of coordination goes on behind the scenes. So you wouldn't think a central banker would really stand out. But Carney he stood out for the wrong reasons. He didn't really stand out in terms of monetary policy. He basically just went along and did what everybody else was doing. And most of the time it was firefighting and cutting interest rates and trying to fend off a financial crisis or a recession during the pandemic. What was different about Carney was he was so willing. He just had open mouth disease. I mean, there's a phrase amongst economists that central banks do what's called open market operations. Carney was a specialist in open mouth operations. You just can't shut the guy up. I mean, he was the first governor, for example, to give a speech to a union here in Canada. And he went and talked to the Canadian auto workers. And that's where he gave an infamous speech where he talked about dead money, where he said he basically accused corporations of sitting on money. Instead, you should have asked the question of why aren't firms willing to invest in this country? Nobody wants to sit on money and have money do nothing. But there were reasons. But he didn't explore that too deeply. He just came up with this theory of dead money. There's a great deal of controversy. A lot of people criticize him. I was led to charge. And he quickly retracted it and said, "Oh, I'm dead money. It's been revitalized," and so on. Right. Another instance is during the Brexit referendum campaign. During the campaign itself, where frankly a governor should not be saying anything to try to tilt the scales of that, he said if we vote for Brexit, Britain will go into a recession, basically trying to scare people into voting for yes. Again, that was quite an extraordinary intervention. But by far the worst thing that Carney ever did, and I think the Bank of Canada still lives with this today, is the idea of taking of discussing with people, accepting the Liberal leadership while being sitting governor of the Bank of Canada. I mean, that is the lack of judgment there is just mind-boggling. I mean, right. the governor of the Bank of Canada has to work closely with the Minister of Finance. They meet weekly. How comfortable do you think Jim Flaherty felt in his weekly meeting with Mark Carney, knowing that Mark Carney could be setting monetary policy in a way that would, make the Flaherty's government look bad during an upcoming election? I mean, it's untenable. It shouldn't have required any thought at all. He should not have taken any incoming calls. And if he wanted to explore it, he should have left the Bank of Canada immediately. So, as I say earlier, I did say some good things about him communicating. His ability to communicate is good, but his exercise of judgment about what he's communicating sometimes shows a very serious lack of judgment, just head shaking.
Yeah. So just so the audience knows also as well a little bit of background about what you're referring to. And I actually I watched the video where Jim Flaherty is there and he's announcing that Carney is leaving for the Bank of England, which in his book, the last chapter of his values book, he calls an improbable fluke. I would, I think probably more than a few people would disagree that sudden departure was an improbable fluke. What was happening at the time is in 2011, Carney had spent some time in the summer with a Liberal MP in Nova Scotia with his family, and as you said, was taking phone calls, was being courted. The Globe had broken, an investigation, had spoke to people. They were working on a ballot. They were planning on him being the perfect alternative to Justin Trudeau. And the press got wind of this. He tried to snuff it out. It didn't work. And then all of a sudden, he left a term early. He left a year early from his position to the UK. And this is where Canadians are supposed to believe that this is an improbable fluke. That might be improbable. So that was a very interesting situation. The other part of that comes up when more recently he had been on the Daily Show with Jon Stewart, and Jon Stewart had essentially made the claim that Carney was coming into the Liberal Party basically to save them. He was an outsider. But what do you think about that claim?
You cannot. He's been at the heart of central banking for 10 years. I can't imagine anybody being more a part of the establishment than Mark Carney. What is unusual is that besides this outsider is I lost my notes here. What I wanted to say. His lack of judgment. Yes, he's not a man of his times. And I wrote recently an op-ed about Justin Trudeau, and I talked about how he basically became out of step with the era he was in. He tried to be, post-national, borders weren't important and all this stuff at just a moment of history where Trump and Brexit made borders important. And we're seeing the same thing with Carney, even more in spades. Because you see for example, all this push that we talked earlier about for green energy and climate change and ESG and all these types of things is just it's disintegrating these days before our eyes. So I think we have another instance here of somebody being quite out of step with Carney is basically like Trudeau. You would call him a Davos man. This guy's straight out of central casting of the World Economic Forum. For him to claim that somehow he's an outsider is beyond belief. Trump is an outsider. He's the poster boy for outsider. Carney is not in the same league at all. He is in the mainstream of progressive thought about economics, about the transition to the green economy, and so on and so forth. You may not like progressive thought, but that's clearly where he has located himself.
Right. Yeah. In terms of, it's interesting, his last chapter of his book, and I guess the summary of his new book, The Hinge, he's trying to paint himself as like somebody who is for the people, right? But yeah, he's part of these larger governing institutions. So I found that interesting myself. In terms of, I know you said it's kind of like a herd mentality. Economists don't actually decide to do things as a sole person. Even if they're a governor, they sort of come together and all send people memos and make decisions, which kind of negates the claim that he's any type of rock star, like an individual standout making decisions. some of the complaints about Carney are, as far as I understand, that he basically did the same thing here as he did in the UK. He lowered interest rates rapidly, did the predictive thing, and then engaged in quantitative easing, which is basically printing money, which caused inflation. So those two things combined, like the dependence on low interest rates, it causes a dependence in the society on low interest rates. People people are responsible for managing their own funds and spending, but it does make them it makes things more risky for those who are not able to manage those behaviors. Or and then the printing of money seems to fuel that as well. Um, so so he really can't then claim to be any type of rock star in his record, would you say, or is that
A couple points on that. One is if you read Ben Bernanke's book, and I've read the books of all the central bankers about how they handled the global financial crisis. I would especially recommend Mervyn King's at the Bank of England. But if you read Ben Bernanke, it's quite instructive that in the 400 or 500 pages, Bernanke, there's one reference to Mark Carney. I had a joint phone call with all the other G7 central bankers on such and such a date. That was it. Nobody was looking to Mark Carney for leadership. Nobody was taking up forward guidance as a great idea. They were too busy trying to save, 19 of the 20 major banks in the U.S. were going under. They didn't need phone calls from Mark Carney distracting them. They had a fire going on themselves that they were putting out. The other thing that's extraordinary, though, is former in the 1970s, a head of the Federal Reserve Board very famously said that the main job of a central banker is to take away the punch bowl once the party gets started. He was always there when we were filling up the punch bowl. When we were cutting interest rates and adopting quantitative easing, he was always there for that. He never hung around for the hard part, which is taking away the punch bowl as the economy starts to improve. He always managed to dance out of town just in time before things got sticky. There's no reason to think, for example, that he would have been any different than any of the other G7 central bankers who all made the same mistake because they all talk to each other. They all subscribe to the same models. They all buy into the same way of thinking. And as a result, they are all faced with sharply higher inflation starting in 2021 and going into 2022. Surprised them all. They thought at first, oh, this is temporary. It's just a supply shock from COVID. It'll go away. And lo and behold, it seems to have actually had something to do also, though, with, we made the fatal mistake of injecting a massive amount of monetary and fiscal stimulus into an economy that was supply constrained. I mean, if you have half a brain, you would predict that inflation was going to be a result. I know I wrote articles in the Post in 2021 saying this is not going to end well. And I was in a distinct minority at the time. By the way, you said economists think in the herd. I pride myself in being outside of the herd on a lot of things. But that was one where there's no reason to think that Carney would have avoided this if he had hung around. But by then, his mandate, his term at the Bank of England had expired, and he was off in Glasgow setting up net zero banking alliances or whatever it was he was doing. So there's nothing extraordinary you can point to. I mean, there are a couple times both here and in England that CPI inflation went past 3%. You can criticize him for that, but it didn't reach the levels of 8% that happened under Macklem. So his superficially his record looks okay, but there's reason to think that he wouldn't have made, if he had stuck around in England, the same thing that would have happened under his tenure that happened under everyone else's. Put
Right.
another way too, he didn't issue any warnings to central bankers, his friends in the central banking business. He didn't warn them in 2021 saying, no, this is not transitory inflation. You have gone too far in stimulus. We are supply constrained. This inevitably is going to lead to inflation. He didn't issue any warnings like that. So he certainly can't take any credit for any great foresight. He didn't anticipate any of the great economic events. He didn't anticipate the global financial crisis of 2008. He didn't anticipate the great inflation of 2022. So we've had these great events happen, and he's pretty much been reacted as more of a bystander. He certainly wasn't an oracle who saw these things coming ahead of time.
Interesting. Okay, so I have a few questions here I'm going to pose for the audience.
Sure.
Let's see. As governor of the Bank of England, Carney was strongly anti-Brexit. To what extent then is he a free trade guy? Thoughts on that, Philip?
I would think again, he's such a mainstream person. He follows the orthodoxy in so much of his economic thought. And economists, and that's one in which I will join the herd, say, free trade is unambiguously good, or I shouldn't say unambiguously. There are winners and losers, but overall, we have a century of evidence of free trade eras being good for the economy and protectionist eras like the 1930s not being good for the economy. So I think he probably is good in that. I think what gets exaggerated by the orthodoxy is that we exaggerate the benefits of trade. It's not a cure-all. Canada, for example, I mean, we're the only G7 nation that has a free trade agreement with all the other G7 members. It hasn't done us a lot of good, has it? I mean, free trade with the U.S., that was a good thing in the 90s, but the deals we signed with Japan and Europe in the last decade, they haven't paid off at all. Our trade hasn't improved. Our productivity has been dreadful. So, we shouldn't exaggerate the benefits of trade either.
That's interesting. That's something I think a lot of Canadians don't know anything about. So we would look forward to an article about that possibly. How is Canada doing? How are our agreements with other countries doing with free trade? I have another question here from an audience member, and I'm not sure. You may or may not have insight into this because of knowing Carney's background in banking. And which major projects do you think that Mr. Carney would likely accelerate through the use of government's emergency powers? Any sense of what that might be for Mr. Carney, given what we know about him?
I'm not sure I even follow the question. Emergency powers. I mean, we saw the government invokes, particularly central banks invoke extraordinary powers. I don't know if they're emergency powers. They're in the toolkit that all central bankers have, including quantitative easing. We saw central banks do very unusual things like directly buying provincial government bonds to stabilize the bond market. But I'm not sure what's meant by emergency powers. Would they close borders during the next pandemic? Would they try to order mandatory vaccination of people? I have no idea what Carney would do in instances like that.
Yeah, it's a newer comment he made. It's a very new comment, so it could. We really don't know. It could potentially be about specific projects he wants to see green lighted as opposed to other projects, maybe. But it's kind of I think at this point it would be hard for anybody to really answer that question. But it's a very new question. So, is it realistic? Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
We've limited ourselves too. I mean, green lighting. People are talking these days about pipelines, and I have an article in the Post this morning saying yes, let's build them by all means, but it's going to be difficult because if you try to rush things through, and you can say this is an emergency, with what's going on with Trump, we have to diversify our export markets to Europe and Asia. But I strongly suspect that the courts would intervene and say, no, 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 you have to go through Indigenous consultation here, and there's rules and regulations. And so, we've we've got so many courts have become so activist. Um, I worry that we've really boxed in ourselves in our ability to handle crises.
Mhm.
The thought of Mark Carney being at the head of the Canadian government during an emergency, um, I would call that an emergency in itself. But
Interesting. Um, uh, Going on to his tenure as well in 2008, uh, while on the Daily Show, on Jon Stewart's Daily Show, Mark Carney sort of took the credit for protecting us from the 2008 financial crisis, the subprime mortgages, everything that hit the U.S. that Canada weathered pretty well. What are your thoughts on that, on him taking the credit for that?
uh, disbelief, rewriting history. I mean, come on, this you can't be serious. Canada's banking system was the one banking system that was not affected by this. And it was because of decisions made by banking regulators and including the Minister of Finance for years ahead of time.
Hmm.
As I say, I remember Ed Clark, when he was head of the Toronto Dominion Bank, said that a group of his managers came in and tried to sell him one day on subprime mortgages. US banks were making a lot of money in this, and they were saying, come on, let's get into this market. We're missing the boat. And Clark sat there and he listened to them. And at the end, he said, I don't know how you make money lending money to bad, risky people.
Hmm.
I don't want any part of this. That
Hmm.
is what stopped Canada from being sucked up into the subprime mortgage. It wasn't any action taken by, it wasn't like Mark Carney the day after he took over in March 2008. And by the way, the global financial crisis and the meltdown of the US financial system was well underway at that point.
Hmm.
It's not like he said, oh, he didn't phone up the banks and say, let's get out of the US subprime
Hmm.
mortgage market right now. They were
Hmm.
never in it. Thank God. And that's what saved us from all that trouble. And for, I say, Carney showed up in the spring of 2008. It was already well underway then. There was
Hmm.
very little Carney could do at that point to insulate Canada. If Canada was insulated from the global banking shock, we weren't insulated from the global economic shock, of course. But in terms of just the financial system, his contribution was minuscule, microscopic, even I would say.
Yeah, and I'm not sure what that says about him that he sat on the show and basically took credit for that on American television, which Canadians would be watching. I remember actually I was working for CIBC before 2008 and after 2008, and CIBC does have American banks as well, and we actually had someone come in and tell us about the performance of the American banks and explained to us very plainly that the reason why we weren't affected because we had things and we had things for a while, regulatory systems that rules that stop that. We have TDSR calculators. You don't lend people more money than they can borrow. This is pretty tight. Getting credit in Canada is not easy. You have percentages that you have to go for. The other thing that was very interesting to me, one of National Post readers actually wrote into me and told me that actually Carney was taking credit for another important Canadian, actually, that who Carney would have been 21 years old when he made these changes, but the individual is named Willard Estey. And Willard Estey had investigated Albertan banks, which were doing basically what the Americans were doing in the that led up to the financial crisis, and he investigated them on various levels, managers, the banks, and then after that point, after his commission, his full investigation, he set up regulatory changes that probably protected Canadians now and what we've been using for a long time. So if Canadians have anyone to thank for protecting them from the 2008 financial crisis, it's probably poor Willard Esty who they have to thank. But well, I'm not sure what it says that Carney has taken credit for that.
Well, it might suggest that he has actually a very shallow CV, and it's going to take some polishing and exaggerating to evidently for him to feel comfortable presenting it to the Canadian people.
Mm-hmm.
As I say, and this man has a problem with exaggeration. As I say, you can see it with dead money, the way he retracted that. Get used to retractions from this guy. He apologized. He had to go. He got hauled before the Britain's parliamentary committee about his comments during the referendum. He had to backtrack on that. So he sometimes the mouth is engaged before the brain.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And sitting back and taking credit for things seems to be something he doesn't mind doing. Let's talk a little bit about Carney's 2021 book, Values. You wrote an excellent review for it about it in the Financial Post when it came out. Mm-hmm. And can you just tell us briefly what the book was about? What was his main thrust?
Well, the main thrust was that it was a disavowal of markets, basically. He was saying that markets have come to put a price on everything. And he's saying markets have gone too far, and instead we need to put values on things. But as I noted, people who talk about values, and our sitting Prime Minister Justin Trudeau is very big in talking about Canadian values too. But people who talk about values, they always assume that the values you hold are the ones that they hold. Mm-hmm. And I wrote in a summary of Justin Trudeau's departure in mid-January in the Post that one of the things that defines modernity is the multitude of values there are. That appealing to values and thinking that you can build a consensus around that it turns out to be just incredibly difficult in the modern world. In fact, it's much easier to build a consensus around things we believe in, such as free trade is generally good for that businesses operate more efficiently than governments. It's easier to build a consensus around things like that than on esoteric things like fairness or equity. Because once you get down that road, of course, everyone's got a different idea of what is fair and equitable in this world. And mostly it means take more money from that guy and give it to me. Of course, and when you get 35 million people saying that, it's very hard to govern that way. So it was I think there's two things I took from that book. One was how as a platform, as a basis for governing, it just goes nowhere because values take you nowhere in terms of governing. And how remarkably self-serving it was. As I say, according to this book, I have done no wrong. I've saved the world multiple times over. It's just laughable. It's no surprise to me that he would go to American television to launch his campaign and make some of these claims, because anybody here in Canada who knows what's going on, he wouldn't get a free pass on it.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's very reading the book myself, and I haven't read the whole book. I found it kind of pseudo-religious, and many of the same comments that you had, moralistic, assuming that people share the same types of morals. The values that he listed, and you put this in your review, were fairness, solidarity, resilience, responsibility, sustainability, humility, and dynamism. That these are, just the ways that he thinks the world should be reshaped, right? And it's the world according to Mark Carney, which he saw as being reset at the time of the pandemic, right? Now you did a very interesting thing. You went at it with facts. You took an example. You took Edmund Phelps, I believe, and you basically said, here are you juxtapose with his contradicting values: independence, initiative, achievement, and acceptance of competition, which goes against Carney, who really, is against meritocracy, or very, very, very suspicious of meritocracy, at least.
Yeah.
And you say, well, look, Phelps, basically, there's evidence here. You want to
Yeah.
explain that a little bit?
Yeah, well, what Phelps, it's very interesting that Edmund Phelps, who's a Nobel laureate writing in the area of economic growth, the values he listed were the values that would appeal to economists. Things like initiative and risk taking, and these are all values that economists can identify with, and they are workable, that you can implement them. It's interesting that after 15 years in finance and central banking, that the values Carney has learned are not economic ones. You would think after all that time, working in the Department of Finance or leading central banks, he would have some sort of notion about values that would have an economic base. But instead, his values are social based. Things like, fairness, solidarity, things like that. They're very soft. You don't know, they're very mushy. They don't tell you anything about how to run a country. They certainly don't tell you how to improve long-term productivity and investment in a country. So I find it remarkable that, I think it just shows how far, as soon as he left the world of central banking, he's been planning on getting back into politics, because these are not economic values. These are social values. You could see Justin Trudeau subscribing to the same group of values. And we've seen where that's gotten this country over the last 10 years.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the things that stuck out to me in the book was that he believes in some kind of idea of a common good, as you were saying before, like, shared values, a common good. Good luck defining that common good. This is something, if a basic philosophy class, 101 class, would tell you, you open up the class with, what is the common good, or what is the good life? You're not going to get everyone answering the same thing, right? And so that's a very kind of, that stood out as quite naive to me as well. Some other things here he'd said recently. I'm wondering what this is going to mean. What kind of leader, if he does in fact win the party leadership, de facto becoming prime minister without being elected. He's made statements such as, recently, fentanyl is a crisis in the USA, but a challenge here. He's made comments on steel, which you probably have some opinions on. He doesn't seem to know that we use it quite often. What would happen, if to the economy, Canadian economy, if Carney started toying with steel as part of his sustainable economic plan?
Well, probably more of the same. That what this anti-fossil fuel, let's lower emissions at all costs, has been the mantra of this government for the last 10 years. And the end result has been, very bad in both senses. We've had the worst economic growth in the G7, partly because of these restrictions we've put on, industries like fossil fuels and pipelines, industries that have wanted to grow, but we've deliberately have restrained. But at the same time, it's remarkable, even though we've restrained the growth of these industries, we've had the worst record on reducing greenhouse gas emissions. As I mentioned in a post article a month ago, we've ended up getting run over in both directions by trying to be in the middle of the road. I mean, it probably would have been better if we just said firmly, we're going to target one or the other. And instead, by trying to say, oh, by the green transition will create jobs, well, we didn't get a green transition and we didn't get the jobs either. So it's, one would hope that the Liberals would have learned from the experience of the last 10 years and not repeat that. But, with all the talk, everything in Carney's background just screams green transition and climate change, and should be the basis of our policy. So Yes, he's come out against the visible carbon tax on households, but I haven't seen him back off in any other parts of his green agenda. So I suspect that that would continue to go forward with the same results for Canada, unfortunately.
Right. That's a really good point. And, as we know, he was the one advising the Liberals all along about a lot of these policies, right? In the background, as an outsider, of course.
Another one he recommended too, by the way, was head
Yeah.
of the Economic Growth Council. He was part of the group along with Dominique Barton, another charter member of the Davos crowd, in saying we should substantially increase our immigration. And the government did that. They did it without coordinating with the provinces. They just threw the gates open. People poured in, and lo and behold, it blew apart our housing market. It overwhelmed government services. Anyways, he was part of the group that thought that much higher levels of immigration would be good for our economy, without thinking about some of its negative, or some of the steps we needed to take to prepare our housing market and our government services for this influx of people.
Wow, yeah, and healthcare as well, all of those things. And in some cases with migrants, we're also paying for them as well to stay here. In terms of the carbon tax, he did say something like he was going to get rid of the carbon tax, but then he was going to replace it with something at least, if not more effective, which basically just says, some other kind of carbon tax to me, or there's something that would be buried in something else. And then he mentioned off a series of initiatives that already exist in Canada government pages about EVs and redoing your home to economic thing. It's almost like Carney hasn't been in the country for a while. Um, yeah. So
And also, like, he hasn't noticed what's going on south of our border.
yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Given that, I mean, he's coming through now. He's claiming this type of expertise, which is anyway, frankly, a different expertise than running a country, right? Um, given all of his experiences, he left here a year earlier. I think he may have left the term in the UK as well a year early. And he's made comments to the effect of, I always come in, or basically to the extent I always come in and start at the top job, stuff like that. Um, does, does Carney strike you as a guy who's going to stick around if he doesn't get that top job? Will he, do you think, doesn't win the Liberal Party leadership, still, stay in a seat as an MP and as an MP in Canada, or will he use one of his other two passports to take another extended vacation?
Oh, there's every indication. I mean, just the whole Trudeau Freeland fiasco was related to Carney supposedly. Obviously, he had led the Prime Minister's office to think that he was going to accept the job of Minister of Finance, and he didn't. So, he's had multiple opportunities to join this government in any position except as Prime Minister, and he hasn't been interested in it. He has not openly declared his political ambitions until the job of Prime Minister became open. So presumably that's the only one he's interested in.
Right. And it's questionable whether or not that's something that says country first. Would he be country first, or which passport first? I think that's all the questions that we have as well to ask tonight. Philip, I want to thank you so much for coming tonight and doing this talk, having your expertise when, Carney, nobody's really gotten the chance from an economic perspective to talk about what Carney's done both in Canada and in the UK. It's been really informative. And so I hope we can do something like this again. And I hope that the viewers as well found it informative and join us for the next MP Talks. Thanks for joining us, Philip.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me on.
Thank you.